The year is 1900. The British Empire stretches across a quarter of the entire earth. Its armies have crushed rebellions from India to Ireland. Its governors sit in palaces across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, convinced that the age of African resistance is over, that the continent has been carved, divided, and tamed, that no one is left who would dare stand up and say no. They are wrong. Because in a small town in the Gold Coast of West Africa, in the kingdom of Asante, a 60-year-old grandmother is about to do something that will shake the British Empire to its core. She is not a trained soldier. She has never commanded an army. She has spent her life as a queen mother, a keeper of tradition, a counselor to kings. But when the British governor sits in the great hall of Kumasi and demands that the Asante people hand over their most sacred object, the Golden Stool, the very soul of their nation, and every man in that room falls silent, too afraid or too broken to speak, she stands up and she speaks. And what she says will launch a war that the British Empire will never fully recover from in West Africa. Her name is Yaa Asantewaa, and this is her entire story. Most people have never heard her name, and that is exactly the problem this video exists to fix. Because Yaa Asantewaa did not just fight a battle, she did not just lead a rebellion. She looked at the most powerful empire in the history of the world, at the absolute peak of its power, and she said, "You have taken our kings, you have taken our land, you have taken our dignity, but you will not take our soul." And then she backed those words up with guns, with strategy, with the kind of military leadership that left British commanders scrambling for reinforcements they had not expected to need. She held them off for months. She made them bleed. She made them doubt. And she did it at 60 years old. As a woman, in a society that had never seen a woman lead an army before, against an empire that had never lost a colonial war in West Africa. This is not a footnote in African history. This is one of the greatest stories of human resistance ever told. And it starts not in 1900 but decades earlier, in a kingdom so wealthy and so formidable that the British spent nearly a century trying to break it. To understand Yaa Asantewaa, you must first understand Asante. Because Asante was not a small tribal chiefdom in the bush. Asante was an empire. A genuine, sophisticated, economically powerful empire that had dominated the Gold Coast region of West Africa, what is today Ghana, for over 2 centuries before the British arrived in force. The Asante had built their power on gold, on trade, on a military tradition of extraordinary effectiveness, and on a political system of remarkable complexity. At the heart of that system sat an object unlike anything else in the political culture of the ancient world, the Golden Stool, the Sikadwa. In Asante belief and tradition, the Golden Stool was not simply a throne, it was not simply a symbol, it was the literal embodiment of the Asante nation. It contained the sun sum, the spirit and soul of every Asante person who had ever lived, and every Asante person who would ever live. It had descended from the heavens in a cloud of white dust and landed in the lap of the first Asantehene, the founding king Osei Tutu, at the moment the Asante nation was born. No one sat on the Golden Stool. Not the king. Not anyone. It was too sacred for human contact. It rested on its own throne. It was carried on its own palanquin. It had its own attendants, its own rituals, its own protection. To threaten the Golden Stool was to threaten the existence of the Asante people at the most fundamental level imaginable. This is the object the British governor would one day demand. And this is why that demand would produce a war. The Asante had been fighting the British for the better part of the 19th century. 4 separate Anglo-Asante wars had been fought before Yaa Asantewaa ever picked up a gun. The Asante had won some of those confrontations, lost others, signed treaties that the British subsequently violated, and watched their kingdom gradually reduced from its position as the dominant power of the Gold Coast to a protectorate that existed increasingly at the pleasure of the colonial administration in Accra. In 1896, following the Fourth Anglo-Asante War, the British made their most aggressive move yet. They arrested the Asante, the king of Asante, a man named Agyeman Prempeh I, along with many of the senior chiefs and members of the royal family. They exiled them to the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles away. They installed a British resident in Kumasi, the Asante capital, and effectively took control of the administration of the kingdom. The Asante were left without their king, without their senior leadership, and without any clear mechanism for organized resistance. The British believed the Asante were finished as a political force. They had miscalculated before. They were about to miscalculate again. And the instrument of their miscalculation was a woman named Yaa Asantewaa. Yaa Asantewaa was born around 1,840 inches, the town of Bessis in the Edweso district of the Asante Kingdom. She came from a royal lineage, which in the matrilineal Asante system, where descent and inheritance passed through the female line, meant that she was connected to the legitimate holders of political authority in her region. When her brother Afrane Panin became the chief of Edweso, Yaa Asantewaa became the queen mother of Edweso, the Ohema. This was not a ceremonial title. In the Asante political system, the queen mother was one of the most powerful figures in any chieftaincy. She was the keeper of genealogical knowledge, the person who knew which candidates were eligible to be chief and which were not. She was a counselor, an advisor, a check on the power of the chief himself. She could destool a chief, remove him from power, if he violated the norms of governance. She had her own court, her own household, her own network of relationships and influence. The Queen Mother was the memory and the conscience of the chieftaincy. And Yaa Asantewaa had been doing this job, doing it well, for decades by the time the British arrived in force. She had watched the British wars with clear eyes. She had watched the treaties being signed and violated. She had watched the gradual erosion of Asante sovereignty with the patience and the long memory of someone who understood that political situations are not permanent, that they are always in motion, that the question is not whether things will change, but who will be positioned to shape the change when it comes. She had raised her grandson Kofi Tene to become chief of Edweso after her brother's death. She had managed her household and her political responsibilities through decades of increasing colonial pressure. She was not a naive optimist about the British. She had seen too much for that. But she was also not a person who had given up on the idea that resistance was possible. She was waiting, watching, learning, building the relationships and the understanding that would eventually make her the most important person in the room when the moment came. That moment came in March of 1900. The British governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, travelled to Kumasi. He called a meeting of the remaining Asante chiefs, the ones who had not been exiled with Prempeh. And in that meeting, he delivered a speech that managed in just a few sentences to commit what was perhaps the single greatest act of colonial political stupidity in the entire history of British West Africa. Hodgson told the assembled chiefs that since the British had conquered Asante, the Golden Stool now belonged to the British Crown. He told them that he expected the stool to be brought to him so that he could sit on it as the representative of Queen Victoria. He told them this as though it were a simple administrative matter. As though he were requesting a piece of furniture, the room went silent, not the silence of submission, the silence of shock so complete that it temporarily prevented speech. Every person in that room understood what Hodgson had just said. He had just told the Asante people that the British intended to take their soul. The silence in that room did not last. But what broke it was not what Hodgson expected. He had expected, perhaps, protest, negotiation, the kind of measured diplomatic resistance that could be managed and eventually overcome. What he got was something entirely different. The chiefs who had survived the British crackdown, who had watched their king taken away, who had bent and accommodated and tried to find ways to preserve some fragment of Asante autonomy within the colonial framework, those men sat in that room and said nothing. They were exhausted. They were afraid. They had been living under British power for 4 years, and the habit of compliance had settled into their bones. Not all of them, but enough of them that the silence felt like defeat even before anyone had spoken. It was in that silence, in that moment of collective failure of nerve, that Yaa Asantewaa spoke. The accounts of exactly what she said have been passed down through oral tradition and recorded in various forms by different historians, and the precise wording varies depending on the source. But the substance of what she said is consistent across all of them. She looked at the men around her and she told them that she was ashamed. That if the men of Asante would not stand up for their nation, then the women would. That she, Yaa Asantewaa, would fight the white men until either the exiled king was returned or she died in the attempt. She reportedly said something along the lines of, "If you, the men of Asante, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white men. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefields." Whether those were her exact words or a version shaped by decades of retelling, the effect they had in that room was immediate and decisive. The silence broke. The chiefs, who had been sitting in paralysis, were suddenly confronted with something they could not ignore. An elderly queen mother was willing to fight when they were not. The shame of that was insupportable, and the meeting that had begun as a moment of colonial humiliation ended as the beginning of a war. What followed over the next several weeks was a mobilization that the British had not thought possible. Yaa Asantewaa was appointed, or took upon herself, depending on which account you read, the role of war leader. The Asante Kotoko, the military forces of the Asante Kingdom, began to organize. Warriors who had been living under British occupation, who had watched their king taken away and their traditional structures undermined, now had something they had not had in 4 years. A reason to fight and a leader worth following. Guns were gathered, powder was acquired. The network of Asante chiefs who had not been exiled began to coordinate in ways that the British resident in Kumasi had failed to monitor adequately. And Yaa Asantewaa, the 60-year-old queen mother who had never commanded a military force in her life, began to plan a war. The first major military action of what would come to be called the War of the Golden Stool, or the Yaa Asantewaa War, was the siege of the British fort at Kumasi. Governor Hodgson and his party, along with the British garrison and a group of civilians, found themselves surrounded by Asante forces and cut off from any possibility of resupply or reinforcement. This was not accidental. It was the product of strategic thinking. Yaa Asantewaa understood that the British strength lay in their firepower and their ability to move reinforcements to wherever they were needed. The answer to that strength was to fix them in place, to make movement impossible, to force them into a defensive posture where their advantages were neutralized and their weaknesses, limited numbers, dependence on supply lines from the coast, unfamiliarity with the terrain, were exposed. The siege of Kumasi fort lasted for months. Hodgson and his party were reduced to eating rats and drinking contaminated water before they eventually managed to escape through Asante lines in a desperate nighttime breakout, leaving behind most of their equipment and a significant portion of their dignity. The British response to the siege was to dispatch a relief column, and then another one, and then another one, because the first 2 were ambushed. This is the part of the story that tends to get left out when people discuss Yaa Asantewaa, because it complicates the narrative of inevitable British victory that colonial history preferred to tell. The Asante forces under her direction were not simply brave, they were effective. They used the terrain, the dense forest of the Asante region, with a sophistication that professional British soldiers found genuinely difficult to counter. They chose engagement grounds where British firepower advantages were reduced by the inability to see more than a few meters in any direction. They cut supply lines. They harassed columns on the march, with hit-and-run tactics that inflicted casualties and sapped morale without exposing themselves to the kind of decisive engagement where British firepower would have been overwhelming. They were fighting the kind of war that the terrain and their resources made possible, and for months they were fighting it successfully. Now I want you to stop for a moment and really sit with what this means. The most powerful empire in the history of the world, at the absolute peak of its power, sent multiple military columns into the Asante forest, and those columns were stopped, turned back, or ambushed by an army led by a 60-year-old woman who had no formal military training, against a force with modern rifles, artillery, and the full logistical backing of the British colonial administration. This was not a minor skirmish. This was a genuine military crisis for the British. And the person at the center of it, the person whose speeches had started the war and whose strategic vision was shaping how it was being fought, was Yaa Asantewaa. She was present at military councils. She was reportedly present in the field. She consulted with her military commanders, and her decisions were executed. She was not a figurehead. She was the war leader. And she was making the British Empire work significantly harder than it had expected to work to reassert control over a kingdom it had thought was already broken. Where in the world are you watching this right now? Drop your country and your city in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know where these stories are landing. Now, let us continue, because the hardest part of this story is still ahead. The British response to the escalating crisis was to pour more resources into the campaign. More troops, more supplies, more commanders with more experience in colonial warfare. General James Wilcox arrived with a significant force in the summer of 1900, and the balance of the war began to shift. Not because the Asante fighting spirit had diminished, but because the material reality of fighting the British Empire was ultimately what it always was: a finite local force against an effectively infinite imperial one. The British could replace their losses. The Asante could not. The British could bring new weapons. The Asante's supply of ammunition was limited, and getting more limited with every engagement. The British could call on reinforcements from across the empire. The Asante had only themselves. This is not a story about military incompetence or lack of courage on the Asante side. It is a story about the mathematics of empire, and those mathematics were brutal. By the end of 1900, the organized military resistance of the Asante was breaking down, not collapsing suddenly, but eroding, slowly and painfully, as positions were overrun and supply lines were cut and the ability to replace losses disappeared. Yaa Asantewaa continued to direct resistance operations even as the situation deteriorated. She was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully or early. She had started this war knowing what she was fighting against. She had not started it because she thought it would be easy. She had started it because she believed that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. The Golden Stool, the dignity of the Asante people, the return of the exiled king. These were not abstract principles to her. They were the substance of everything she had spent her life protecting. In late 1900, Yaa Asantewaa was captured by British forces. The accounts of her capture are spare in their detail. She was taken. She was not killed. The British, who were not entirely without political calculation, even in their moments of colonial brutality, understood that executing a 60-year-old grandmother who had become the symbol of Asante resistance would create a martyr whose power in death would exceed her already considerable power in life. Instead, they exiled her. Following the same template they had used for Prempeh, they sent her to the Seychelles, to the same island cluster in the Indian Ocean where the Asante hen was already living in exile. She would never return to Asante. She died in the Seychelles in 1921 at approximately 80 years of age, having spent the last 2 decades of her life in exile from the kingdom she had fought to protect. The immediate military outcome of the War of the Golden Stool was a British victory. In the narrow sense that is accurate, the organized armed resistance ended. The British retained control of Asante. The formal annexation of the Asante Kingdom into the British Gold Coast colony, which Hodgson's demands had been intended to consolidate, was completed. On the face of it, the British got what they came for. But history is not written only in the immediate aftermath of battles. History is written in what comes after. And what came after the Yaa Asantewaa War is a story that fundamentally complicates any simple narrative of British victory. The British did not get the Golden Stool. This is the detail that matters most and that tends to get buried in accounts of the war. The entire provocation that started the conflict, Hodgson's demand that the stool be brought to him, was never fulfilled. The Asante people had hidden the Golden Stool before the war began, and the British were never able to find it. During the war itself, there was an incident where some workers found the hiding place of the stool and stripped some of its gold ornaments, thinking to profit from the discovery. They were arrested and tried by the Asante, not by the British under traditional Asante law, because the Asante refused to acknowledge that the British had any jurisdiction over the stool. The Golden Stool remains in Asante hands to this day. It is still the most sacred object in the Asante Kingdom. It is still never sat upon. It is still the symbolic heart of a people who refused, even in military defeat, to surrender what mattered most. Yaa Asantewaa had started a war specifically to prevent the British from taking the Golden Stool. The British never got it. In the most important sense of the conflict, she did not lose. The British were also forced to significantly reconsider their approach to governing Asante after the war. The kind of aggressive, contemptuous, culturally destructive administration that Hodgson had represented was recognized, even within the British colonial apparatus, as having been counterproductive. The war had been expensive, embarrassing, and politically damaging. The spectacle of an elderly African woman leading a months-long military campaign against the empire was not the kind of story that played well in the newspapers back home or in the colonial offices where policy was made. The British shifted toward a more indirect approach to governance in Asante, one that worked through existing Asante political structures rather than trying to demolish them. And in 1924, 3 years after Yaa Asantewaa's death in the Seychelles, the British allowed Prempeh, the exiled Asantehene, to return to Kumasi. In 1926, he was formally reinstated as Asantehene. The kingdom that the British had thought they had permanently broken had reconstituted itself around the political and cultural institutions that Yaa Asantewaa had died in exile defending. But to understand the full significance of what Yaa Asantewaa did, you have to look beyond the immediate military and political outcomes and ask a harder question. What does it mean to resist? What does it mean to fight a war you cannot win in the conventional military sense, and why would a person of intelligence and experience choose to do that? Yaa Asantewaa was not naive. She had lived long enough and seen enough of the British to understand the material realities of what she was taking on. She knew that the empire had more guns, more soldiers, more money, more logistical capacity than the Asante could ever match. She knew that military victory in the sense of expelling the British from the Gold Coast was not a realistic outcome. So why fight? The answer lies in understanding something about how political change actually happens. The British colonial project in West Africa was not ultimately ended by military defeat. It was ended by a long accumulation of resistance, political pressure, economic disruption, and the gradual shift in what the British public and British politicians were willing to pay to maintain empire. That accumulation had to start somewhere. Every act of resistance that forced the British to commit more resources, to take more casualties, to make more concessions, to adjust their approach, was a brick in the wall that would eventually bring the colonial system down. Yaa Asantewaa's war was one of the most important of those bricks. It demonstrated to the Asante people and to West Africans more broadly that the empire was not invincible, that it could be made to bleed. That organized resistance, even against overwhelming material odds, could extract concessions and force reconsiderations. It kept alive the idea of Asante sovereignty at a moment when that idea was at its most threatened, and ideas that are kept alive, even at enormous cost, have a way of eventually reshaping the world. The Gold Coast became independent Ghana in 1957, becoming the first sub-Saharan African country to achieve independence from colonial rule. When Kwame Nkrumah stood before his people and declared independence, he was standing on ground that had been prepared by decades of resistance, by every Asante warrior who had fought in the 4 Anglo-Asante Wars, by the political traditions of a kingdom that had refused to fully submit even when it could not fully resist, and by a 60-year-old queen mother who had stood up in a room full of frightened men and said that she would fight. The connection is not metaphorical, it is direct. The Asante resistance tradition that Yaa Asantewaa embodied was part of the living political inheritance that Ghanaian independence drew from. She was not a historical curiosity, she was a link in a chain. She was also something more personal and more immediate than a political symbol. She was a demonstration of what individual human beings are capable of when they decide that some things matter more than their own safety. Yaa Asantewaa had a life she could have lived quietly. She was a queen mother. She had status, comfort, a household, responsibilities that did not include leading armies. She could have watched Hodgson's speech with the same silent compliance that paralyzed the men around her and gone home and told herself she had done what she could. No one would have blamed her. She was 60 years old. She had earned the right to let someone younger carry the weight, but she looked at that room and she made a different calculation. She decided that the question of who was going to fight was less important than the question of whether fighting was the right thing to do. And once she had answered the second question, she had already answered the first. This is the quality that separates the people who change history from the people who watch history happen to them. Not necessarily superior intelligence or superior resources or superior military skill. The willingness to act on what they believe when acting on it is genuinely costly. Yaa Asantewaa paid the full cost. She spent the last 20 years of her life in exile, thousands of miles from everything she had lived for. She never saw her grandson again. She never returned to Edweso. She never sat in the court she had governed for decades and heard the affairs of her people. She died in the Seychelles in 1921, old and far from home, having given everything she had to a cause that she had known from the beginning might not succeed in her lifetime. There is a question that history forces us to ask about people like Yaa Asantewaa. Was it worth it? The question sounds almost obscene in its pragmatism, but it is the question that serious engagement with history demands we sit with. She suffered enormously. Her people suffered enormously. The war killed thousands on both sides and ended in British military victory. The exile was real and the loss it represented was real. So was it worth it? The answer to that question requires us to think carefully about what we mean by worth it. If we mean, did Yaa Asantewaa achieve her immediate stated objectives, the return of the exiled king and the protection of the Golden Stool, the answer is partial. She did not live to see Prempeh return. But he did return. The Golden Stool was never surrendered, and the Asante kingdom, which the British had intended to permanently subordinate into a featureless colonial possession, retained enough political coherence and cultural identity to reconstitute itself after the colonial period ended. These outcomes were not inevitable. They were shaped in significant part by the resistance that Yaa Asantewaa led. Her war made certain things more costly for the British and certain ideas more survivable for the Asante. That matters. But the worth it question also has a larger dimension. What Yaa Asantewaa did was demonstrate something about human dignity that transcends any specific political outcome. She demonstrated that being colonized does not mean being broken, that submission to superior force in one moment does not determine what you are capable of in the next. That the most powerful empire in the world can be made to reconsider its assumptions by someone it had every reason to dismiss. An old woman, a queen mother, someone without an army or a treasury or a diplomatic network or any of the conventional instruments of power. She had her voice and her courage and her understanding of what her people needed and what they were capable of. And she used all three to change the course of history in a small but real and permanent way. The legacy of Yaa Asantewaa in contemporary Ghana and in the broader African world is significant and still growing. She is recognized as a national hero of Ghana. Her image has appeared on Ghanaian currency. There is a museum in Kumasi dedicated to her. Schools and streets carry her name. In 2000, exactly 100 years after the War of the Golden Stool, Ghana held major commemorations of the centenary of her uprising. She has been the subject of academic studies, novels, plays, and films. She is invoked regularly in discussions of African women's leadership and African resistance to colonialism. She is, in short, exactly what her actions made her in the heat of 1900, a symbol. But not an empty symbol, a symbol that is pointing at something real. What she is pointing at, when you trace the line of her story from beginning to end, is the relationship between dignity and freedom. These are not the same thing, and they do not always travel together. The British imposed a political system on the Asante that significantly constrained their freedom. They took the king, they installed a resident, they collected taxes, they made decisions about the governance of the kingdom without meaningful Asante participation. That was the loss of freedom. But dignity is something different. Dignity is the sense of being the author of your own story, of having your worth and your significance acknowledged, first by yourself and then by the world. And what Hodgson's demand for the Golden Stool threatened was not just Asante political freedom, which was already substantially compromised, but Asante dignity. The claim that the British Crown owned the soul of the Asante nation, that the sacred heart of a people's identity was just another piece of colonial property to be appropriated, was an assault on dignity of the most fundamental kind, and Yaa Asantewaa understood this. She understood that you can lose political freedom gradually through negotiation and accommodation and still survive as a people. But if you lose your dignity, if you accept the claim that your sacred things belong to someone else, that your identity is theirs to dispose of, then you have lost something that political freedom cannot restore. This is why the Golden Stool mattered so much, not as a piece of metal, however beautifully worked, but as the physical expression of the principle that the Asante people existed, that they had a soul, that their identity was real and coherent and theirs. Defending the Golden Stool was defending the idea that Asante existence was not contingent on British permission, that it did not begin with colonialism and would not end with it, that there was something prior and something more fundamental than the colonial arrangement, something that no governor and no annexation decree could legitimately claim to own. Yaa Asantewaa understood this with a clarity that the men around her had temporarily lost. They were so overwhelmed by the immediate material reality of British power that they had forgotten what they were actually protecting. She reminded them by being willing to die for it herself. And that reminder, that act of witness, is what made her more than a military commander or a political figure. It made her the keeper of something essential, the person who held the meaning of the struggle when everyone else had temporarily forgotten what the struggle was for. She was also, it is worth saying plainly, extraordinarily courageous in a way that deserves to be named and not just implied. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the decision to act in spite of fear, And the fear that Yaa Asantewaa would have felt in that room in 1900 was entirely rational. She knew what the British did to people who resisted. She had watched the arrests of 1,896. She knew that starting a war against the empire could end in her death, in the deaths of people who followed her, in destruction that would fall on the Asante people she was trying to protect. She was not operating in ignorance of the consequences. She was operating in full knowledge of them and choosing to act anyway, because the alternative, the silent acceptance of Hodgson's demand, seemed to her worse than any of those consequences. That is not recklessness, that is moral clarity. And moral clarity in the face of overwhelming power is one of the rarest and most valuable things a human being can exhibit. The British Empire, for all its military and economic power, produced relatively few people capable of that kind of moral clarity. It produced excellent administrators and competent generals and shrewd diplomats. It produced people who were very good at the calculus of power, who understood how to accumulate it and how to deploy it and how to maintain it. What it did not produce, in its colonial dimension, was people who could look at what they were doing and see it clearly for what it was. An old woman in the Gold Coast, with no formal education in the Western sense, no access to the libraries of London or the debating chambers of Parliament, saw it more clearly than most of the people who designed and administered the system. She saw that what was being demanded was not governance or taxation or even military submission. It was the surrender of identity. And she refused. That refusal, that single act of standing up in a room where everyone else sat down, set in motion a chain of events that resonates still. The Asante kingdom still exists. The Asante Haini still sits in Kumasi. The Golden Stool still rests in the palace, never having been sat upon, never having been surrendered, waiting for ceremonies that are still conducted with the same reverence that they were conducted with before Frederick Hodgson sailed to the Gold Coast and made his impossible demand. The thing that Yaa Asantewaa fought to protect is still there. That is not nothing. In fact, given everything, it is everything. She died in exile, yes. She did not see the full vindication of what she had fought for. She did not live to see Ghana independent and free, to see the Asante Haini restored to full dignity, to see her name on museum walls and in school books and in the speeches of politicians who invoked her memory as evidence of what West African women were capable of. She died in the Seychelles in 1921, and the world she died in was still a world organized around the principle that empire was natural and permanent, and that African resistance to it was a historical curiosity rather than the beginning of something that would reshape the entire planet. She did not know how the story ended. She only knew how she intended to live her part of it. And that, finally, is the deepest thing her story teaches us. You do not have to see the end of the story to matter in it. Yaa Asantewaa could not see 1957. She could not see Nkrumah. She could not see the independent Ghana that her resistance helped make possible, or the Africa that has emerged from the long process of decolonization that her war was one small but real part of. She could only see her own moment, the room, the governor's demand, the silence of the men around her, and she could feel the pull of what needed to be done and the cost of doing it. And she made her choice. That choice was the contribution. Everything that came after it was built on foundations that included her courage, her strategy, her refusal to accept that the British had the right to own the soul of her people. Yaa Asantewaa, Queen Mother of Edweso, war leader of Asante, exile, the woman who stood up when everyone else sat down. The woman who held the British Empire to a standstill in the forests of the Gold Coast for the better part of a year. The woman who died far from home defending the idea that her people's identity was not for sale and not subject to conquest. She did not win the war in the conventional sense, But she did not lose the thing the war was actually about. The Golden Stool was never surrendered. The Asante people are still here. Their kingdom still exists. Their sacred traditions are still practiced. And her name is still spoken with reverence, 120 years after she stood up in that room and refused to be silent. The world was not ready for her in 1900. It told itself that a 60-year-old African woman could not be a serious military and political figure. It was wrong then. And the stories we tell now, the way we remember her and why we remember her, are a small part of the ongoing correction of that error. She deserved to be known. She deserved to be remembered. And now you know her story. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, the history that was always there, documented, real and extraordinary, but never quite told the way it deserved to be told, then you know what to do. These stories survive because people choose to share them. Make that choice.